Are you ready? Okay. Good afternoon. Greetings. Welcome to this wonderful occasion. My name is Susan Levine. I'm the director of the UIC Institute for the Humanities, and I'm very pleased to welcome you this afternoon on behalf of the Institute and all of the academic and administrative units and individuals who came together in really unprecedented ways to bring you this international symposium on slavery and its aftermath in the Atlantic world, and the concurrent UIC Library exhibit, Commerce in Human Souls, the Legacy of the Atlantic Slave Trade. We're very excited to be hosting this event as part of UIC's 30th anniversary celebration, and also as part of the 30th anniversary of the Humanities Institute as well. I especially wanted to thank Chancellor Paula Allen Mears, Provost Lon Kaufman, the Liberal Arts and Sciences Dean, Astrida Tantillo, for their support, and to acknowledge the hard work of faculty in the departments of African American Studies, English, History, and Political Science. In addition, the symposium has enjoyed the support of the Social Justice Initiative at UIC, as well as the University Library, the Office of International Affairs, the Great Cities Institute, the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Affairs, the Honors College, and the Program in International Studies. We also received generous support from the Illinois Humanities Council and the British Consulate General of Chicago. So you can see it's really quite a collection of units that have come together to sponsor this event. Finally, I also want to say that this symposium was inspired initially by the UIC Library's unique collection of works on abolition, the founding of Sierra Leone, the transatlantic slave trade, and modern Caribbean literature. And the library, as you probably know, is featuring some of these rare documents in an exhibit, which you'll be able to see tomorrow afternoon as part of the symposium. So keep your eyes open for that. Before we start, I do want to remind you that the symposium will begin tomorrow at 10 a.m. In the Cardinal Room, which is right around the corner, I think, with a panel on abolition, Freetown, and empire. And now I'd like to introduce UIC Provost Lon Kaufman to offer some words of welcome.
Well, welcome everybody. I bring greetings on behalf of Chancellor Paula Allen Mears, who couldn't be here today. This turns out to be one of those weeks at UIC that are where there are so many things going on that are great. It's impossible to go to all of them. Starting earlier this week with Nobel laureate Jody Williams and Jesse Jackson, for the first time in his life, in Hull House, having a conversation about violence. Certainly uniquely related to today's program and to the next 2 days as well. This event is one that would not happen anyplace else except UIC. It's over 200 years in the making, clearly, but the series of events that lead to this potential for events like this at UIC are commonplace here, but not anyplace else. And I hold the key to the mystery that many of you want to know. How did the British consulate get involved? And it's a uniquely typical story of UIC in this event. The British consulate became involved at a luncheon at the Honors College. Now, the luncheon at the Honors College was really to have some people meet the British consulate general who was there. And he happened to be there because he wanted to come on campus to meet with a set of students who might be thinking about applying for Rhodes and other kinds of scholarships and fellowships. And so the dean, Betty Bottoms, had put together a set of people to come to lunch, which included Dick and Nancy Cirillo and Jennifer Woodard. And Jennifer Woodard knew about the collection that had come from Sierra Leone and said, what about that collection from Sierra Leone? Does the British consulate have any interest in that? And that started the ball rolling. And so it's one of these ropes of sand that happens on this campus because of the way this campus views the world and thinks about individuals and thinks about history and thinks about Chicago and the people who are here and how they come to be here and where they're going next. And it's what makes this campus special. So thank you to all of you for making this happen. It should be a great 3 days, and hopefully at the end of the 3 days we will start another week with another 3 days. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, Lon. I hope the next week actually has 7 days or 5 days at least. So, I'd like now to introduce Natasha Barnes, Associate Professor of English and African American Studies, who will introduce our speaker this afternoon.
Thanks, Susan. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natasha Barnes. I am an associate professor in English and African American Studies. I have the tremendous honor to welcome Lawrence Hill to Chicago and UIC. And on behalf of the committee, we're especially fortunate to have a writer of his renown to open our symposium and the library exhibition attached to it, Slavery and the Aftermath of the Atlantic World. Lawrence Hill was born in Canada to civil rights activists' parents who devoted their lives to telling the history of Black Canadians. After a short career in journalism and newspaper journalism, Mr. Hill turned his talents to fiction and essay writing that explored the meaning of racial identity in Canada, and he very quickly became one of the most important young literary voices in contemporary Canada. Since 1992, Lawrence Hill has published many award-winning short stories and novels, including Some Great Thing, Any Known Blood, and, of course, his 2007 magnum opus, The Book of Negroes, published in the United States under the title Someone Knows My Name. Someone Knows My Name is the American version of this book, to the disappointment and consternation of those of us who preferred the old title, Book of Negroes, but you can ask Mr. Lawrence about that in questions. But this book was an amazing book. It won the prestigious Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and I know we're in the States, and I think I see a few of my students, so I need to tell you how important that is. The Commonwealth Prize is actually an annual prize written for the best novel in English from 4 major geographic regions. So Mr. Lawrence Hill sits in the company of writers like Vikram Seth, Salman Rushdie, J.M. Coetzee, Ian McEwan, Zadie Smith, V.S. Naipaul. I could go on and on. In addition, the novel won the Rogers Writers Trust Fictional Prize, the Ontario Library Association Evergreen Award, and it was longlisted for the Scotiabank Gilray Prize. In 2008, under its American title, the novel was a finalist in the United States for the Hurston Wright Legacy Award. Lawrence Hill's interest in challenging the archive of Canadian history has led to many other interventions. He's written, I love this, I've seen it too, a beautiful children's book called Trials and Triumph, The Story of African Canadians, and he's written Women of Vision, an important history of the Canadian Negro Women's Association. Mr. Hill also wrote the script to the documentary Seeking Salvation, A History of the Black Church in Canada, which won the Wilbur Award for the Best National Television Documentary in 2005. Now, permit me, I just need to spend a few minutes talking about the achievement of Somebody Knows My Name, or my favorite title, The Book of Negroes, because it's a gloriously written fictional autobiography of an enslaved African woman, Aminata Diallo, who was captured as a girl from the coast of West Africa and survived the Middle Passage and enslavement in South Carolina. With the outbreak of the American Revolution, this war gives her a tenuous freedom as a Black Loyalist working under British officers who promised freedom to enslaved Blacks who assisted the British in the war against the 13 colonies. So Aminata's odyssey continues. She goes to Nova Scotia as a community of free freed Loyalist blacks and eventually becomes a member of those Nova Scotia settlers who set up a free colony of returned Africans in Sierra Leone in the 19th century. And please go to the exhibit, which is going to open formally tomorrow, because the Sierra Leone is such an important site of a lot of the documents we have. But let me get back to the book. Lawrence Hill's narrator is a bit of all of the Black Atlantic voices that have helped us know a little something about the history of forced migration and terror from those who experience that history from below. Aminata is a bit of Equiano, a bit of Frederick Douglass, a little bit of Phyllis Wheatley, if Phyllis Wheatley lived in an environment that would have permitted her to write oral history as opposed to proving herself with neoclassical poetry. But what this novel does most forcefully for those of us who are gathered here for the next few days is to speak to what the archive enables and forecloses. Hill has Aminata act as the official scribe of one of the most fascinating documents of the Revolutionary period, a document called the Book of Negroes, which lists the names of some 3,000 African-descended men, women, and children, Black Loyalists, who the British offered freedom and safe sanctuary to the Canadian province of Nova Scotia in exchange for their service to the British war effort. So in this book, Lawrence Hill imagines, and of course only the way a novelist could, what it means for an African woman in 18th century America to act as a scribe, to commit to posterity a list of names, ages, and physical descriptions of a new community of African Americans who are to embark on another global journey that promises uncertain futures. When we visit that library exhibition tomorrow, Commerce in Human Souls, an exhibition that has these marvelous, incredibly telling, but always in some way ethically compromised documents that will be on display, please remember what Lawrence Hill tells us about the many layers of necessity and compromise in the production of history itself. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm UIC welcome to Lawrence Hill, whose talk today is entitled Faction, Merging History and Fiction in Someone Knows My Name / The Book of Negroes. Thank you. Please join me.
Thank you very much, Natasha, for that warm introduction. Can you hear me okay in the back seats? Thank you as well to Provost Kaufman and to Susan Levine and Linda Vavra and all of your colleagues at the Institute for the Humanities. This is actually, I'm ashamed to say, my first visit to Chicago, and I'm delighted to be here. I live near Toronto, Canada, where I was born and raised, and my mother was from Oak Park, actually. She was raised in an extremely conservative, I guess you might say down here, Republican, white family in Oak Park. And she lost actually access to most of her family when she married an African-American man. And on the campus at Howard University in 1953, as they left the United States the day after they married and moved to Toronto, where they set up base and became lifelong human rights activists fighting for the enactment of human rights legislation in Canada and raising a family, my brother and sister and I, in Don Mills, a suburb of Toronto, where we grew up in the early 60s. I suppose it was a natural reaction to living and being reminded daily in the States, my father having served in the U.S. forces in the Second World War, that of course he was black and she was white. They could never escape that here. And so they set up in an entirely white suburb of Don Mills, Ontario, not necessarily a great service to their children, but an understandable move on their part. And I suppose growing up in an environment of complete ambiguity where you're not quite sure who you are or where you fit in, and our sort of doses of black culture were limited, for the most part, in my early childhood to forays to D.C. or North Carolina or Brooklyn, where all of my father's family was. We didn't really have access to my mother's family except for a twin sister with whom she's always remained close. And so it was my father's family that became our American family in the States. So I grew up with a foot really in both cultures and in both countries, but planted legally, and in terms of my passport, in Toronto, Canada. My father was the son of an African Methodist Episcopal church minister, and also the grandson of one, both of whom had studied at university and gone to Lincoln or Howard. My grandfather was a dean of theology at Howard University until his retirement in the 1960s. And he was understandably obsessed, my father, with the notion of education as a means of inuring oneself perhaps against the vicissitudes of discrimination or racial injustice. And so he was very anxious that we, his children, should become literate and be embarked on professional paths. And so I remember really I must say as a novelist that no self-respecting immigrant to Canada wants to see their child become a novelist. You know, they're looking for doctors, lawyers, engineers, architects, anything that they consider respectable. And so it was with great concern that my father saw his first son, my oldest brother, drop out of high school to become a singer-songwriter. And it was with equal palpitations that he saw me embark in a career as a novelist. Such was his obsession that we should become literate and become thus professionals that at the age of 6 he decided that I should begin to write letters for the things that I wanted. And if I wanted something badly enough, I should deliver a letter for it. And he already was the chair of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and true to form as a bureaucrat, I had to write for the things I wanted. And so at the age of 6, I wanted to have a kitten. And he said, "You can't." He was an inveterate pet hater. "You can't have a kitten, Larry." I asked a second time, no. I asked a third time, no. But any self-respecting 6-year-old should ask at least a few times for something they want. So on the third request, he said, "If you really want that kitten, go up to your bedroom and write me a letter. And tell me in the letter why you deserve to have the cat, and whose allowance will pay for its cat food, and how you will prevent it from having babies in the closet. And if you can write me a well-rendered letter with no spelling mistakes, I'll give your request due consideration." And I got the cat, and from that point on, I had to write for every single thing I wanted. And so he should never have asked me to write those letters if he'd wanted me to become an architect or a doctor. He shot himself in the foot because I became a novelist. There is really no better way to learn to write with passion than to write for something you want, to write to change your world, to write to obtain something, to change the fabric of your daily life. So I wrote to get things, which children should do. And my own 5 children have learned very quickly how to get the things they want from me. So it's great to be here. And although my father passed away 10 or so years ago, my mother's still around and reads all of my manuscripts in draft form, which is a wonderful service. It's great to be here at this conference, Slavery and Its Aftermath in the Atlantic World. And it's interesting. I don't know if you can identify with this, but as a Canadian who, although I'm a novelist and a former journalist, I still go into schools, high schools and universities to talk perhaps once every couple of weeks to students, mostly in Canada. I run into a lot of opposition from students and some teachers who really kind of roll their eyes and say, "Do we really have to hear about slavery again? You know, is this doing me any good? Do I need to hear this story? What good does it do? All it does is make me feel bad, and I'm tired of it. And can we get on with it? Do we have to discuss this?" So it's a challenge to actually make the issue of slavery relevant to students, certainly in Canada in the year 2012. And I have to fight pretty hard to do it. And one of the things I do is to talk about contemporary slavery. And although thankfully the transatlantic slave trade ground to an end, for the most part, I guess with the abolition, the British abolition of the slave trade in 1808, and then moving forward, 1807 I should say, and then moving forward, various forms of colossal injustice continue to this day, including contemporary slavery. And I know that experts in the States and Canada and the UK estimate that as many as 30 million people are currently held in conditions that can only be described as slavery, many of them women and girls. And I make this connection so that students aren't allowed to think that this issue is dead and gone and doesn't need to be discussed, and there's no relevance in the dramatizing, as I do, of slavery to modern society. But it is a challenge to reach out to students and to make them believe that it's worth learning about and understanding. I do find that sometimes, although I could never write the books I've written without the assistance of historians and without relying on historians, drama sometimes is a wonderful way to excite the young imagination about history. A story, a personal struggle is often one great technique to excite a young imagination about something as painful and complex and variegated as slavery in the Atlantic world. So drama is my stock in trade as a novelist. And with that brief introduction, I'd like to talk to you a bit about the historical underpinnings of Someone Knows My Name. And I'll read you one or two brief excerpts from the novel. I thought I might speak for approximately 40 or so minutes and then take your questions. Hopefully you'll have some. It's funny, you know, I'm not a historian. I'm a novelist, and I think I've perhaps overcompensated for the lack of historical training by reading too much to prepare for this novel. Reading, of course, is a great way to procrastinate and to put off the serious business of writing. Research is a great way to avoid work as a writer, as a novelist. And I spent a lot of time researching this novel, as I have other works. But I knew as a child, without having to open a book, I knew from conversation around the kitchen table that the first person to die in the American Revolutionary War was a black man by the name of Crispus Attucks, who sided with the rebels. And this, of course, becomes part of American folklore. You can't grow up as a son of even a black immigrant to Canada, a black immigrant from the States to Canada, without knowing that Crispus Attucks was the first to die in the American Revolutionary War. But interestingly and sadly, most Americans and Canadians that I've met really have no idea about the thousands of African Americans who chose to serve the British on what became the losing side of the American Revolutionary War, and who suffered and benefited to some degree from the consequences of their involvement with the British. And the title in Canada and in most other English-speaking countries in the world, the Book of Negroes, draws its inspiration from a historical document of the same name. The first time in the history of the United States or Canada that thousands of black people are publicly and formally documented by a formal and public institution, in this case the British Navy, is in 1783, after the British and the Americans have signed a peace treaty in Paris. During the war, the British did everything they could to win, and one of the tricks they pulled out was to promise freedom in writing to those African Americans who'd profit from the chaos of revolution and come behind British military lines and serve the British in the war. Since the island of Manhattan was the locus of British control during the war and held by the British through almost the entirety of the American Revolution, it was to Manhattan, and I emphasize the island of Manhattan, because you can't get on or off without the sanction of the British Navy at this time. It's to the island of Manhattan that thousands of African Americans repair who choose to serve the British in the war. And they come as cooks, road builders, midwives, prostitutes, spies, soldiers, with their children and spouses in tow. They come desperate to cash in on the freedom and equality that they've been promised by the British in writing. And the British are very crafty. They promise freedom to any rebel-owned slave who will come serve them in the war, but they will not liberate their own slaves. They happily hang on to them and bring them to Canada and to other colonies, British colonies, after they lose the war. But they do promise freedom in writing twice to African Americans who will flee their rebel plantations and come serve the British. So they come to New York, and they stay there, and they hide, and they work, and they've been promised this freedom. But at the end of the war, the British go to Paris and sign a peace treaty, and they promise in the peace treaty not to evacuate Negroes or other property considered to be owned by the American rebels. So they've promised freedom, and then they've gone and said in the peace treaty that they won't actually give it. And so they finally go ahead and give it anyway. And they begin to evacuate in ships leaving New York over a 6-month period between April and November 1783, evacuate approximately 3,000 African Americans to, well, mostly to Nova Scotia, a British colony just 9 days away by ship on the Atlantic seaboard. A handful go to Germany, A few go to England, 1 or 2 go to Quebec City, and a few go to the Caribbean. But almost all, 95% of those registered in the Book of Negroes, this document kept by the British Navy, go to live and work in Nova Scotia, Canada. In order to leave, these so-called Black Loyalists, because they wish to remain loyal to King George III, have to have their names entered into this document, the Book of Negroes, which is, again, the first time we see thousands of black people publicly documented by a public institution. We see this document now running to 150 pages, containing 3,000 names, 9 columns of information, up to 9 columns for each person, their name, age, perhaps where they were born, who used to own them, how they served the British during the war, what they look like, a very short, pithy, rude description of how they look, where they're going, what ship they've embarked upon, and where they're going in Nova Scotia or to another country. If they're married, do they have children? A fascinating, living, breathing document. I've seen it photocopied in the New York Public Library, and I've seen it in microfilm in the Canadian Archives and in the Nova Scotia Public Archives. But the original, which I only saw after the book came out, and I was invited for an audience with the Queen, for which my mother, an American, will never forgive me. The first time I saw the original was in London, England, after meeting the Queen. And the original Book of Negroes is held in the National Archives of the UK in Kew, England, just, 15 miles from Buckingham Palace. So once your name is entered into the Book of Negroes, which is sort of like a community passport, you are allowed to sail away on a ship to Nova Scotia. These 3,000 African Americans, most of whom are free, a few of whom are held as slaves of the British, go to Nova Scotia, where they become known as the Black Loyalists. Canada has a history, an African-Canadian history that goes back fully as far as African-American history in time. But obviously the numbers in Canada were much, much, much smaller than they are here in the United States, and that they were at the time. And we didn't have plantation slavery because our climate didn't allow for it. So slavery was, on a smaller scale, was mostly confined to urban situations, people working in homes as opposed to on farms or plantations. But the first documented slave in Canada stretches back to 1828. Sorry, 1628, my mistake, 1628. A boy from Madagascar, 8-year-old boy whose name is Olivier Lejeune, named after the Catholic priest who owns him in Quebec City. So this is the first documented slave in Canada, 1628, Olivier Lejeune. The Black Loyalists who come to Canada in 1783 are thus not by any means the first blacks to come to Canada, but they're the first large wave of people of African descent coming into Canada in a short window of time together, 3,000 or so. It's quite a massive influx into Canadian shores. And although the Black Loyalists have been saved by the British by being evacuated from New York, they're very quickly betrayed by the same British in Nova Scotia. They've been promised land, don't get it. Tools to break the land, don't get it. Provisions to live off while they're hoping to get tools to break the land, don't get it. Political and social equality, don't get it for the most part. And their existence is so horrific. Some are starving and freezing to death in Nova Scotia. Some of them are hanged for trifling offenses such as stealing bags of potatoes because they've been starving. And some of them are forced literally to dig holes in the ground in the very cold Canadian Atlantic winter to survive in holes in the ground, covering themselves with the boughs of trees to stay alive through Canadian winters. They are so disenchanted with these broken promises of their first 10 years in Nova Scotia. You don't really have to take my word for it. The historical record will show you what they do. After 10 years in Nova Scotia, they leave, many, about a third leave, 1,200 to be exact. They leave in 15 ships sailing from the port of Nova Scotia, Halifax in Nova Scotia in 1792, and they go to found the colony of Freetown in Sierra Leone. If a person, say in Canada, knows a little bit about the history of African peoples in the world, that person might have heard about Marcus Garvey advocating a return to Africa in the early 1900s. A similar person might well have heard of Americans founding with former slaves the colony of Liberia in the early 1800s. but they're likely not to have heard that more than a century before the life of Marcus Garvey and decades before Americans found the colony of Liberia, the first massive exodus of black peoples from the Americas who are heading to Africa comes from the shores of Halifax, Nova Scotia, January 15th, 1792. 15 ships carrying 1,200 men, women, and children sail across the ocean. Astoundingly, about a third of these adventurers, as they were called in writing, a third of them were born in Africa, enslaved in the Americas, liberated or self-liberated in New York City, come to Nova Scotia, and before they die are going back to the mother continent. A story I had never heard amongst all the stories about slavery and freedom and civil rights that I'd heard growing up with parents as I had in Toronto. I'd never heard this story. And when I began to learn about it, I was so fixated by these two migrations from New York to Nova Scotia, and then 10 years later from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone, that I just had to write a novel about it. And so I wrote Someone Knows My Name, which is set sort of in the literary tradition of the slave narrative. It's a novel. It sits on a historical foundation, but through and through, it's a novel. The characters are invented. Even characters with real names, such as King George III or Sam Francis, are characters that I play with in my imagination for the purposes of the novel. So it's a novel that sits on a historical foundation, but it's inspired by the slave narrative. And to come back to students for a minute, when I do come across keeners in high school who want to hear about black literature, I always talk about the slave narratives, and I always explain that the first form of writing published widely by peoples of African descent in the Americas, Canada, and the States is the slave narrative. And so I point back to that, and this novel is written in that literary tradition. Aminata Diallo, who's actually named after my eldest daughter, middle name is Aminata, tells this story. And it follows the migrations that I've just described. She's uprooted and enslaved as a child, just a barely pubescent girl in Mali, where I worked many years ago, brought to the Americas, comes up to New York, goes over to Nova Scotia, back to Sierra Leone, where she was not from, but to Sierra Leone, and then finally to London, England, to advocate near the end of her life for the abolition of the British slave trade. So, because it's a painful story, I wanted to start it in her old age to reassure the reader that she'd make it and everything would be okay. It reassured me too. This novel writing and the research occasioned many nightmares, and so writing in the voice of an old woman who'd made it to old age from the first page was a way of reassuring myself too that it would be okay, and that I could make it as painful as it needed to be, but it would be okay because she was going to make it. And this going to make it, especially the survival of her emotions, is, I guess, my primary meditation in the novel. How does one survive emotionally the worst insults that one can visit on one's humanity? We see this all the time. We see this today. Children who survived genocide in Rwanda, survivors of the Holocaust, survivors of the war in the former Yugoslavia, survivors and the descendants of survivors of the transatlantic slave trade. How does a person survive with their emotions intact? A miracle, but it happens every day, even now. So this is Aminata's case. So I'll read you a couple brief excerpts from the novel, this one from her old age in London as she's beginning to tell her story, which becomes this novel. The other day, they took me into a London school and had me talk to the children. One girl asked if it was true that I was the famous Mina D, the one mentioned in all the newspapers. Her parents, she said, did not believe that I could have lived in so many places. I acknowledged that I wasn't Mina D, but that she could call me Aminata Diallo if she wanted, which was my childhood name. We worked on my first name for a while. After 3 tries, she got it. Aminata. 4 syllables. It's really not that hard. Aminata, I told her. She said she wished I could meet her parents and her grandparents. I replied that it amazed me that she still had grandparents in her life. Love them good, I told her, and love them big. Love them every day. She asked why I was so black. I asked why she was so white. She said she was born that way. Same here, I replied. I can see that you must have been quite pretty, even though you are so very dark, she said. You would be prettier if London never got any sun, I replied. She asked what I ate. My grandfather says he bets you eat raw elephant. I told her I'd never actually taken a bite out of an elephant, but there had been times in my life when I was hungry enough to try. I chased 300 or 400 of them in my life, but never managed to get one to stop rampaging through villages and stand still long enough for me to take a good bite. She laughed and said she wanted to know what I really ate. I eat what you eat, I told her. Do you suppose I'm going to find an elephant walking about the streets of London? Sausages, eggs, mutton stew, bread, crocodiles, all those regular things. Crocodile, she said. I told her I was just checking to see if she was listening. She said she was an excellent listener and wanted me to tell her a ghost story. Honey, I said, my life is a ghost story. Then tell it to me, she said. As I told her, I am Aminata Diallo, daughter of Mamadou Diallo and Sira Koulibaly, born in the village of Bayo, 3 moons by foot from the grain coast in West Africa. I am a Bamana and a Fula. I am both, and we'll explain that later. I suspect I was born in 1745 or close to it. Let me begin with a caveat to any and all who find these pages. Do not trust large bodies of water, and do not cross them. If you, dear reader, have an African hue and find yourself led toward water with vanishing shores, seize your freedom by any means necessary, and cultivate distrust of the color pink. Pink is taken as the color of innocence, the color of childhood, but as it spills across the water in the light of the dying sun, do not fall into its pretty path. There, right underneath, lies a bottomless graveyard of children, mothers, and men. I shudder to imagine all the Africans rocking in the deep. Every time I've sailed the seas, I have the sense of gliding over the unburied. Some people call the sunset a creation of extraordinary beauty and proof of God's existence. But what benevolent force would bewitch the human spirit by choosing pink to light the path of a slave vessel? Do not be fooled by that pretty color, and do not submit to its beckoning. Once I've met with a king and told my story, I desire to be interred right here in the soil of London. Africa is my homeland, but I've weathered enough migrations for 5 lifetimes, thank you very much, and I don't care to be moved again. So those are some of the opening pages of Someone Knows My Name. Certainly the hardest part of the novel was finding the voice of the old woman. The rest of the story fell into place more easily once I had that voice. I chose to sort of give her an unrelentingly difficult life, but it's hard to beat up a reader in a novel. You can't. You have to sort of respect the reader's delicacy, and a little violence and a little hardship is enough to speak for a lot more that goes unstated but is understood, and finding the balance between a realistic portrait and one that a reader can stomach is a challenging thing. One of the things that fascinated me in trying to dramatize the story of Aminata arriving in the New World was one of linguistic adaptation. And of course, she goes to work on St. Helena Island, which is one of the small islands off the coast, and the sea islands off the coast of South Carolina, just north of the border of Georgia. The sea islands have this rich, fertile land that allows for the production of indigo, which becomes a major cash crop of these islands off the coast of Georgia and South Carolina in the 3rd quarter of the 18th century. Indigo, of course, is a plant that grows to about the height of a cornstalk, and there's a fine powder on the leaves, which is extracted through a very complicated technique that I won't bore you with right now. But the dye is extracted from these leaves and goes on to provide this dye that's in great demand at the time in Europe, this dye, this color that we now associate with sort of the color of blue jeans. And so indigo is a major cash crop of these islands, and it's very dangerous work because it's mosquito-infested land, and particularly if you're white, you're likely to die of malaria, even though the mosquito is not known to be the vector of malaria in the 3rd quarter of the 1700s. It's known that if you're working in the spring, summer, or fall, in these areas, you're very likely to die in what's known as the 6th season. And so St. Helena Island and other islands off the coast of South Carolina become this kind of interesting experiment in African-American history, because they're the only place where we find the emergence of a new language, the Gullah language, and it's a place in which African-American slaves are left entirely in their own charge for many months of the year because it's mortally dangerous for a white owner of a plantation to live there. And so this black culture flourishes in relative isolation. And it's to this area that Aminata arrives as a child, as a 11-year-old girl or so. Coming off ship, unable to communicate with any people around her, she's got to learn to speak an English that's acceptable to her white owners. She's got to learn to speak an English that will fly in black culture, and she's got to learn to speak Gullah. Basically, she's got to learn 3 languages like that to prove herself useful and to survive. And I think we often underestimate the linguistic agility of these Africans who are arriving in bondage in the New World. I was very fascinated by that process and chose to dramatize it in this novel. I'm going to read you just a tiny excerpt from her first moments in what later becomes the United States. Sullivan's Island, which is just off the coast of Charleston, where Africans are held in captivity until they're ready to be sold into slavery. We were brought to an island just off the coast of the Tubabu's land. There were about 100 of us left. We were all placed inside a square barricade. Tubabu stood as sentries at the gate and patrolled inside with clubs and fire sticks, but mostly we were left alone to wonder what would now become of us. It seemed to me that we traveled to the other side of the sun. On this side of the world, the sun was worn out and not to be trusted. My fingers grew thick and numb every night and throbbed every day as the sun climbed the sky. My ears were cold. My nose was cold. Like the others, I'd been given a rough cloth barely long enough to wrap around my backside. I shivered at night on the sandy earth, and one morning I awoke to find smoke trickling from my mouth. I thought my face had caught fire. I thought that someone had bedeviled me during the night or branded my tongue. I waited for the burning. I held my breath. No smoke. I breathed. Smoke again. It came from within me. No burning, just smoke. The smoke in my breath continued until the sun began to climb the sky, and then I noticed that others too had smoke mouths in the morning. During the American Revolutionary War, more people died of smallpox than did of wounds inflicted by military battle. And in this same time, African Americans are concocting homemade inoculations against smallpox. So I won't read it to you now, but I have a scene that I'm quite engaged with in which a woman who comes to take care of Aminata, comes to become a kind of a second mother to her, an enslaved woman by the name of Georgia, inoculates Aminata with this homemade remedy against smallpox. The idea being that if the inoculation doesn't kill you, it'll allow you to survive the next wave of the disease, which is ravaging populations, black and white, urban and rural. Something that quite fascinates me. Aminata in this novel is a midwife. Her mother was a midwife, and anybody who's lived or traveled or comes from, say, the West African countries where I've worked, Niger, Cameroon, Mali, will know that children travel on their mothers' backs. And so Aminata, as a child, growing up in the middle of the 1700s, is the daughter of a midwife. So where her mother goes, she goes. And the babies that her mother catches become the babies that she too learns to catch at a very young age. She's pretty skillful with her hands by the time she's 10, helping her mother catch babies. And she uses this trade to great effect to make herself useful and to survive in the New World. And I found it a powerful and engaging metaphor to imagine a heroine who, on one hand, will inevitably lose her children as a result of being a slave in America, but who will have to go on catching the babies of other women who go on giving birth. So she's a midwife. This defines her life, and it's central to the novel. I think what I'll do is just take a moment or two to share with you a few of the interesting visual images that I came across as I was researching the novel and help me conceive of and imagine the novel and how to write it. Oh. Sorry. Could you help me just for a second with getting this slide projection up on the screen? There was a young person who was helping me, just a colleague helping me a few minutes ago, and I can't find the button. Would you mind coming up to help me bring this up onto the screen? Thank you so much. There's an icon, and I'm not sure where it is. Oh, thanks. And then this. Great. Oh, and then we're going to maximize. Thank you very much. Okay, so one of the things that I had a lot of trouble envisaging as I was writing the novel was how it was that African people came to be enslaved and captured in Africa. And of all the readings and the fiction that I'd read and the poetry and essays about the transatlantic slave trade and about slavery in the New World, I had yet to understand the manner in which people were captured and brought into slavery from Africa. And finally, I began to visualize it more clearly when I came across a memoir written by Mungo Park, a Scottish doctor, who's one of the very first Europeans to travel deep into the heart of West Africa in the very late 1700s. And of course, students who don't know the story aren't aware that Europeans weren't penetrating into West Africa in, say, the early and mid-1700s. They were limited to their coastal slave factories, so they conducted their business from the coast and bribed and paid African intermediaries to do their dirty work and to bring captives to them. And Mungo Park describes the concept of a coffle, a word I'd never even heard of before. A coffle, C-O-F-F-L-E, being basically a string of people who are attached by the neck, sometimes as many as a village of people attached by the neck and forced to walk, sometimes for months, from their place of residence to the sea, where they're sold into slavery. And this terrible image visualizes, it provides an example of what Mungo Park was talking about in his memoirs written in the late 1700s. This is the work of Jonathan Green, a Gullah artist who is from South Carolina, but I believe lives in Florida now. And it's very contemporary, modern, colorful strokes. He sort of presents Gullah life to Americans today. And the idea of a man sitting in a tree while stories are being told, or the vivid colors that he projects, sort of helped me realize that I needed to strip away the idea of slave, the concept of slave, see beyond the idea of a faceless person in chains, and to try to find personality and get that personality onto the page so a reader could see a real person, not a slave. This is probably an image meant to represent the Caribbean, but these are vats of indigo in the Caribbean. Same thing's happening in flatter territory in the Sea Islands of South Carolina, where the plant is soaked in various vats until a dye is extracted to generate, finally, this color, indigo, which is in such demand in Europe at the time. This, again, is the third quarter of the 1700s. This is a smallpox pustule, and seeing some of these made me imagine the scene in which Georgia inoculates Aminata against smallpox. This image was probably one of the most profoundly influential images that I came across, this and many other maps like it, as I was researching the novel in the library at the University of Toronto. Aminata, as others did, a few others did, in the course of slavery in the Americas, learns to read and write with great aplomb. And once she learns to read and write, which is a skill that will really enable her to get out of North America and eventually go back to Africa, she starts looking at maps, and she wants desperately to find maps. And she feels shame that she's from Mali, although it's not yet known as Mali. She's from West Africa, but she wouldn't know how to get back if somebody gave her a ship and allowed her to direct it. She doesn't really understand where she comes from geographically. And she feels a measure of shame that she doesn't really understand or can't visualize how to get home, even if she could, from the New World, where she's been taken as a child. So she starts looking at maps every time she can find one. And for the first time in my life, as I was researching this novel about 6 years ago, I started to look at maps myself that Europeans made of Africa in the 18th century. And I was astonished at what I found. I was both fascinated and revolted. For one thing, they're often bordered by these drawings or little paintings, which one might call cartouches, or these miniature little paintings that are meant to depict various forms of African life. For another thing, you see these incredibly, unbelievably idiotic perceptions of African life through the eyes of Europeans who haven't been there, images that are just preposterous on these maps, such as a naked woman lying on the back of a lion or something like that. You see images like this frequently in these 18th century maps. And another thing that you see is that often when a cartographer who's, say, from the Netherlands is drawing a continent that they really know nothing about, when they really don't know what they're going to put, they just stick an elephant. Because why not? You know, you don't know what's there, so why not just put an elephant down there? And so in this map, you see elephants smack dab in the middle of Africa, because why not? What else are we going to put there? Put some elephants. And so as I saw these elephants, for want of towns, you know, in these 18th century maps, and was horrified and fascinated, I started to wonder, was I at risk of projecting a 21st century mentality onto an 18th century African woman by giving her a measure of anger and fury at seeing these images of Africa in maps? And I wondered, can I do this? Can't I do this? Does it work? Does it not work in fiction? And finally, I was so thrilled. My character's born sometime around 1745. I was so thrilled to find a poem by Jonathan Swift, penned in 1733, 12 years before she's born. And what does Jonathan Swift do in this poem? He satirizes these very maps. So if Jonathan Swift can do it in 1733, I felt that my character can feel a measure of anger when she's born in 1745. And this is what Jonathan Swift has to say about maps like this. So geographers in Afric maps with savage pictures fill their gaps. In o'er uninhabitable downs place elephants for want of towns. Jonathan Swift, thank you very much. Sam Francis, I'll talk about him later to those of you who are interested. A very fascinating story about a man who owned the Francis Tavern, where George Washington celebrated his victory dinner after taking Manhattan at the end of the war. For the most part, I understand that some Americans choose to think of him as white, and many others prefer to think of him as black. I chose to depict him as black in this novel, but a very interesting character who becomes George Washington's first steward or chief cook after Washington becomes the first president. Wall Street, African burial grounds, the burying of African peoples north of Manhattan, north of the city itself, in the woods, because, of course, they're not allowed to bury their dead in churchyards. This is a proclamation from John, Earl of Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, the British governor of Virginia. So John, Earl of Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, is a slave owner, but he's a Brit. And in this written document, he's promising freedom to any American rebel-held slaves who will leave slavery and come to serve the British during the war. So this is one of the two written documents I referred to, promising freedom and security to African Americans who will flee their plantation slavery and come behind British lines. This is a photocopy of one of the 150 pages from the document known as the Book of Negroes, and you have to really get in there and look at it carefully, but when you do, it becomes so interesting and so vital. The first person on this particular page is Jack Hyde, who's listed as being 50 years old, and there's a description of him almost past his labor. Well, you can sort of imagine what that means, and so it goes with 3,000 other names who are entered into the Book of Negroes. A fascinating, fascinating document. Many Canadians are happy to point at the historical warts of our southern neighbors and talk about American slavery without even knowing that slavery existed in Canada as well until 1834, when it was finally abolished throughout most of the British Empire. And so in the illustrated edition of the Book of Negroes, which unfortunately was only published in Canada as an illustrated edition, there's also, these are all images from the illustrated edition, there's also an ad from Canada advertising the sale of a slave in Halifax, Nova Scotia, of two slaves, I guess, in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So there are advertisements in the book photocopied so that Canadians are sort of forced to recognize that slavery existed in Canada as well as in the United States. So you're looking at an ad now that's offering African peoples for sale in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Rose Fortune, Canada's first policewoman on the Nova Scotia coast, who's also a stevedore, who throws people in jail for being publicly drunk and is sort of a very beloved historical figure in Nova Scotia, Canada, dating back to the 18th century. And this picture appears to be an idyllic rendering of the arrival of the Black Loyalists, those who'd left New York, come to Nova Scotia, and have gone back to found the colony of Freetown. This is a bay with the coast of Freetown and Sierra Leone in the background, and you might think that this is sort of a beautiful rendering of freedom and Black Loyalists finally making it back to Africa, and so they are. However, on the extreme left of the painting, if you're able to see this more closely, you'd have a chance to notice that the vessel on the far left is a slave vessel. And there are small dugout canoes which are ferrying African captives to this slave vessel. So as the Nova Scotians are arriving to liberate themselves and to found the colony of Freetown, other Africans are being stolen, put onto slave ships, and sold away. And it's really not an exaggeration. Although the Black Loyalists found the colony of Freetown in Sierra Leone, 18 miles away is Bunce Island or Bance Island or Bance Island, depending on what vowel you use to spell it, and the vowel changes over time. But Bunce Island was one of the most active slave factories in all of West Africa, located just 18 miles from the Freetown and very active at the time that the Black Loyalists arrived. So they're setting up camp basically next door to one of the most bustling slave factories in all of West Africa. In this, this caricature I found absolutely fascinating, and it's done by James Gilray. And of course, British caricaturists have this tradition, this fantastic tradition of these incredibly caustic, biting, courageous satires of public figures. And James Gilray was the major caricaturist of his time. This was done in 1792, this particular one. You often find blacks, or sometimes find blacks in the caricatures of James Gilray, although there are none in this particular caricature. It's of interest to you, I'm sure, as it was to me. As I'm sure you know, John Bull is the British equivalent of Uncle Sam. John Bull refers to the British family, and here, the royal family. And here we have King George III and his wife, Queen Charlotte, sipping tea with their many children. Well, why is this so funny, and why is this so biting? What's James Gilray after in this caricature? Well, Queen Charlotte is happily encouraging her children and husband to take their tea without sugar, because they must feel dreadfully bad about the vicissitudes of slavery. And so maybe if they just took their tea without sugar, they'd help those poor enslaved peoples around the world who are shedding blood in order for sugar to be available in the British Empire. And it's a biting and stinging satire because, of course, there's no nation in the world profiting more fully from the slave trade than Great Britain in 1792 when this caricature is produced. So it's a very hostile and caustic portrait of the hypocrisy of the royal family. So a fascinating caricature, and one that sort of got me thinking about Aminata's mindset as she arrives in London near the end of her life. Those are just a few of the many images I came across in the context of my research for the novel, and I just thought I'd share them with you since they motivated my own creative thought so much. That sort of concludes my formal part of the presentation, but I'm happy to take your questions if you have any and chat. And also happy to chat afterwards as well if some of you wish to do so one-on-one. And I believe somewhere in this building there are books for sale as well if any are interested. Thank you. So if you have a question, I'm happy to answer. Yes, Nancy.
I wonder if you would tell us how it came to be that the book entitled Book of Negroes in Britain and the Commonwealth had to have this title changed and was published by the American.
Thank you. Nancy's asking why the title change. Why is it that the novel is known as the Book of Negroes in Canada, the UK, South Africa, Jamaica, most countries where English is spoken, it's published as the Book of Negroes. Why is it called Someone Knows My Name in the United States and Australia and New Zealand? Well, it was first published in Canada, And then we sold rights to the American market, and W.W. Norton and Company, producer of the wonderful Norton anthologies, bought the book to release in the United States. And they've been wonderful to me. And but they couldn't sell. They promised to publish it as the Book of Negroes. We had a full discussion about it when they were pitching to buy the book in manuscript form. Their first catalog, pre-publication catalog, listed the book as the Book of Negroes with a distinct title cover than the one you'd see now, and but they couldn't sell it. The bookstores would not pre-order the book with the word Negroes in the title. Bookstores were refusing to order the book from Norton pre-publication with the word Negroes in the title, American bookstores. And so at the very last minute, just a few days before going to print, I'm called by my editor in New York, and at this time I'm on book tour in the Baltic, up in the Baltic Sea in the north of former East Germany, and I'm emailed by my editor who says, sorry, but we're changing the title and it's going to print in a couple of days, and by the way, here's the new title. And we can't have Negroes in the title. It's just too inflammatory, for the American market. And I had about 2 days to reject the title they were proposing and come up with a new one. That was the best I could negotiate. Someone Knows My Name became the title. Naming is a big deal in the Book of Negroes. The loss of name is a big deal. The insistence on retention of a name is a big deal. It's a way of recognizing one's own humanity, not to insist on holding on to one's name. And so even the term Someone Knows My Name is used by one character and speaking to another in the novel. So I felt that if I had to change the title, I'd change it that way. But that's a short answer to a complex question. It's interesting because my African-American cousins in Brooklyn pleaded with me to change the title and warned me that I'd have trouble if I published a book as the Book of Negroes in the States. And those cousins love me, but they didn't want to see the book come out as the Book of Negroes. And they're all sort of very active, progressive community members in Brooklyn, my age or older, and didn't want to see that title. Most African-Americans that I've met on tour in the States are also very troubled by the title, the Book of Negroes, and tell me that they wouldn't go near the book if it were called that, in the United States. Canadians seem to like the title, and they seem to feel that it sort of resurrects a forgotten document that Canadians should know about, as it has to do so profoundly with Canadian history and Black Canadian history. The title has had repercussions in other countries too. In the Netherlands, it was published in a direct translation from the Book of Negroes, the title. And last summer, after I was quite welcomed in the Netherlands on book tour, and after I was quite welcomed by the Surinamese community in Amsterdam, one individual was so offended by the title, using the Dutch word for Negroes in the title, that he chose to burn the cover of the book, at an anti-slavery monument in Amsterdam. And of course, TV cameras were rolling. It became big news in Canada, where I am from, in the Netherlands. And he was basically trying to intimidate, the publisher into withdrawing the book and bookstores into not selling it. I'm not a fan of book burning. I understand his objections to the word, but he didn't read the novel, and he burned it because he didn't like the word in the title and didn't trouble himself to find out why the title was such. But the title has generated controversy in the Netherlands, and my publisher wanted to skirt that same problem by calling it Someone Knows My Name in the States. When the film comes out, I don't know what it will be called, and we're still debating that matter. Yes. Yes, go ahead.
I have a question. You talk about doing all of your research, and I was just wondering, did you come across any characters in your research, real-life historical characters that especially touched you and inspired you?
Did I come across any real-life historical characters in the research that inspired me? I didn't come across a woman on whom I modeled Aminata, if that's what you're asking, but I did imagine her as I read about the people leaving Nova Scotia and going to Africa, many of whom had been born in Africa. I came across Sam Francis and fictionalized him in the novel, and there's a very brief fictional rendering of King George III and Queen Charlotte, near the end of the novel. There are a few characters who are real in history who are given short treatment in the novel in a fictional way, but for the most part, although the migrations were carefully researched, and although I tried to be faithful to my understanding of the transatlantic slave trade and of slavery in the Americas, Canada included, I created characters really from my own heart and did not model them specifically on real people. And even the few who are minor characters who have real names have been changed and fictionalized. Yes?
Thank you for your presentation. I had a question. You said something earlier about your involvement in schools and how you move about. And when you mentioned the word slavery, the term slavery, and bring it up, there's this reticence, there's this reluctance to talk about it. And that's sort of, in my mind, sort of linked to this idea of post-racialism and people feeling uncomfortable talking about contentious issues. Briefly, can you speak about the importance and the function of collective memory and why it is important to talk about these things and embrace them?
Well, thank you. Can I speak about the importance of collective memory and why it's important to remember and think about painful issues such as slavery? Well, for one thing, I think that every generation has to come to its own terms about the monstrously painful issues of our past. Every generation will surely be thinking about the transatlantic slave trade and about the Holocaust and about the decline of the Roman Empire. We all think about matters of human history, and we all have to come to terms with them in our own way and in our own time. So why should our grandchildren and great-grandchildren not be meditating about these issues and trying to make sense of them in their own way? I can't see why they shouldn't. They will, and I hope they do. So you can't really move into the world fully without being aware of your past. I'm not particularly interested in the attribution of blame as a novelist. I didn't write the novel in an accusatory frame of mind. I wrote the novel more in a celebratory frame of mind. I was trying to celebrate the incredible resilience of a woman who would not be beaten, who would not consent to have her own humanity stripped, even as she's forced to visit gross indignities through much of her life. So it's a celebration, I think, of human resilience, which is in many ways what this story is all about. It is very hard to speak to young people about this and to excite them about it and to overcome the natural reticence that many of them have in sort of moving into this area. But again, in my case, I find it's possible to do if one finds contemporary connections to a historical past, as I do in talking about modern-day slavery, and I also find that it helps to dramatize these histories with personal stories of personal struggle that sometimes make it possible for a person to step into a history that they might otherwise ignore or pass by. Yes?
I wondered whether you found yourself thinking about other historical novelists, in particular other novelists of slavery.
When I was writing the book, did I think of other novels of slavery? Well, sure I did. And of course, often in Canada, I'm teased about writing the Canadian equivalent of Roots, which I think is a little preposterous. It just, I think it's sort of a crazy thing to say, but of course I read Roots and was, profoundly excited by it, as so many millions of people were when it came out in the 1970s. I read it as a young man. And in many ways, it kind of set the gold standard in terms of exciting a broader public about an incredibly painful issue. And regardless of what you might think about Roots, it'd be hard to contest it. It just generated such a wave of interest in African American genealogy. It excited people about their backgrounds, about their past. I mean, Roots is all about making a connection from the present to the past, making a connection that most African Americans who are indigenous African Americans who are the descendants of slaves can never make, which is it can never make in a tangible and specific way that's nation specific to trace their ancestry back to Africa. Interestingly, now in the 21st century, we find something that Alex Haley could never have imagined, perhaps, and that is DNA testing to try to determine your own ancestry. And I find that there's an incredible thirst among African American and African Canadian cultures to find yourself through DNA testing, a thirst to try to ascertain, perhaps through genetics, what you cannot find in the archives. What is this thirst all about? Well, ultimately, my instinct as a novelist tells me it's about a desire to make a connection that's so very hard to make in the context of your own family, a connection to the mother continent. So Roots was certainly one of many novels that I considered. But when I was 14 or so, I sort of dropped all the junk that I've been reading as a child and moved into adult literature overnight. I sort of dropped the Hardy Boys, which I'm ashamed to have read, and then suddenly started reading Native Son, which and Another Country, and Langston Hughes, and Ralph Ellison, and these were the books that populated my parents' bookshelves. And so at 14, my eyes opened, and I just inhaled the hundreds of books that were on their bookshelves, most of them dealing with African American culture through poetry, essays, or fiction. And so I just devoured hundreds of these books as an adolescent, and they influenced me profoundly. The immediacy of African American poetry, say Langston Hughes, or novels, or Gwendolyn Brooks's poet, or novels having to do with the experience of slavery and its repercussions over time, became really the first literature I ingested as a teenager. So I couldn't really shake it as I was writing the Book of Negroes. And if there's anything that I owe to it, I guess it would be the sense of immediacy, moving straight into the heart of a story. Yes? Of imagining something rather than remaining faithful to the truth, so to speak? Well, you're asking the question of a novelist, so I'll have a very biased answer. I mean, I think that it all depends on the expectations that you give your reader. What is a book? There's a terrific novel by an American writer. It came out a few years ago, and it posits that after the Holocaust, the promised land for Jews becomes Alaska. And yeah, Michael Chabon, thank you. And it's a really interesting novel. It sort of turns history on its head and suggests that instead of Israel, Alaska becomes the promised land for Jews after the war. Quite a wild idea, but clearly he sets up in the reader's mind the expectation that this is a novel that plays with history. So as a novelist, I think that your first responsibility is to let the reader know, one way or the other, and I very clearly let the reader know, and I think you should, what to expect. Are they reading fiction that purports to reflect with as much accuracy as possible the time that it's depicting, or they're reading fiction that playfully and happily subverts a received truth and turns things on their head, as, say, Michael Chabon did? I don't think there's a better way to do it. I think that the way to do it is to be honest and be faithful to your own inclinations as a novelist. So I personally don't have any problem with novelists subverting history, intentionally playing with it, turning things upside down and going in all sorts of directions, because they're getting at things that are deeper than just the historical truth. Novelists can do things that historians can't do, and I think they should take advantage of some of the freedoms that they have to play and to get at truths in their own way. So again, I think it comes down to the expectations that you give your reader. Clearly, if your reader is led to understand that they're reading a novel that is supposed to be fairly accurate in terms of its historical underpinnings, then you'd better do a good job of doing that to the very best of your ability. But I'm not troubled by the imagination in fiction, even as regards to history. On the contrary, I think it's wonderful when people do it successfully. And if they don't, then criticize them. That's fair. Yes, sir.
I'd just like to make a comment, because I spent a lot of time with the Book of Negroes written on it. And I really admire it. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, and I'm going to go right out and get it. I really admire it, especially for the point of view of blacks who experience this. I think in Canada, the Book of Negroes means a lot, because Canada But just one comment on the book itself. The book itself was written by whites, and the people were British officers. And a lot of the time, they talk about the people in the book as if they're property, as they describe them as if they're property. But they don't, one of the things is they sort of assume that they fought for the British, and they list certificates of whom they fought for by initials, so that most of the people who looked at it haven't seen how many people fought for and what is the first way they fought. But one of the things that's really interesting is that there are a couple of pages on which suddenly people begin to talk about whom they served with and where they fought. And when one person does that, 30 do. There are two passages in the Book of Negroes where this happens. So it really stands out as being part of the kind of point of view that we capture. And I would just say that I think it's completely a matter of imaginative honor that you've done this. And that it does a real service to the people who, in fact, lifted up the whole situation by fighting the
Thank you for your comments. I'll just add that, yes, the Book of Negroes is no way of getting around it. It's a painful document, and it's a harsh document. People are described in the most offensive and demeaning ways. The book is written by officers in the British Navy, assistant deputy quartermasters, people like that are the people who write it. There are several authors of the Book of Negroes, several scribes. I turned Aminata into a scribe, that we know well that there was not an African woman helping to write the Book of Negroes, although I had her do so in the novel and acknowledged in the afterword that no such thing could have happened, but it did happen in the novel. So yes, it's a painful document. It's a disturbing document, but it's still an important one to sort of understanding the connections between Africa, America, Canada, and Great Britain. Sir, you had a question in the back there.
Just wondering, was there any particular reason why the British chose Nova Scotia?
Why did the British choose Nova Scotia? Yes, there is a reason.
And connected with 30 years before they removed the French, out of Nova Scotia. Did that have any bearing on it?
It didn't have to do with the French, really. It had to do with the fact that Nova Scotia is very close by. It's only 9 days by ship from Manhattan. It's on the Atlantic seaboard. It's close to New York by ship. It's a safe British territory that the rebels aren't going to be able to touch because it's removed from what has just become the United States of America, but it's close. And it's got land, in huge quantities, but land that unfortunately does not turn out to be very arable for the most part and will not be given for the most part to the Black Loyalists. So it's close and it's convenient and it's safe, and so that's why they go. And there's land, and that's why they go there. And there's labor that's wanted. And of course, the Black Loyalists who arrive end up hugely contributing to the construction of the town of Shelburne. Shelburne becomes the largest black community in Nova Scotia at the time. Halifax isn't yet a black community. It will become a black community later, the largest in Nova Scotia. But at the time, Shelburne is the first. And Shelburne on the south shore of Nova Scotia becomes, for a short time, a boom town, and it becomes the fourth largest harbor in all of North America. The fourth most significant harbor, the fourth greatest amount of commercial activity. And so it's a hugely significant harbor built by black labor. Yes?
You mentioned briefly about the importance of naming to the individual Africans. I'd like for you to elaborate that and also tell me why is it that you decided to come up with the name of Leone?
Why did I call it? So, the very last words you said, sir, I didn't hear.
Why did you choose to focus on the ethnic group that you did?
Oh, good. Okay, why did I choose to focus on the ethnic group that I did, and why is she called Amina or Aminata, and what about the importance of naming in the novel? Well, really, I think one of the most...
You discovered that naming was important for the folks that you were researching.
I'm sorry, because there's a bit of background noise. Again, the last sentence you said I could not hear.
When you were speaking, you indicated that naming was very important to the subject that you were studying. Can you elaborate on that? And then also tell me, given what you know about that, how is it that you came to come up with the name that you didn't focus on the food?
Thank you. I think it's well established that one of the most effective ways to strip a person of their humanity is to not deny them their name or to refuse to allow them to use their name, say their African name, once they're brought into a state of ownership in the new world. And so Aminata's insistence on using her name and having it recognized is an act of resistance. It's an act of clinging to her past and refusing to let it go. The name is very significant to her and to others. When she's on a slave vessel, in the middle passage, early in the novel, she's moved around. Women, girls were a great danger, but they also had more physical mobility on slave vessels than did male captives. They were allowed to move around more. There are some obvious reasons for that, some of which put them in great peril. But women moved around more on slave vessels than men did. They had more physical mobility. So Aminata travels and moves around the ship, and she comes across men who call out to have her say their name. And one man in particular is desperate, who's met her earlier, is desperate to hear his name spoken by her. And the act of saying his name makes him feel for a nanosecond a flash of humanity in the midst of a nightmare that will last for weeks and weeks and weeks, the middle passage. And so to say his name gives him back for a moment his humanity. So it's very important emotionally to say the major characters in the novel that their names be respected and, if possible, said aloud and retained. I chose the name Aminata as I did for a couple of reasons. For one thing, I named her after my eldest daughter, and I asked myself the very painful question in order to make the novel lift off the page. What if this were my own child? How would she have managed? How would she have survived emotionally? How would she get through this journey if this were my own daughter? So I named her that way after my eldest to force myself to write with more emotion about her journey and make myself feel it more integrally. Why Aminata? She's born around 1745. She's born in what is now southern Mali. And the only people in this part of the world who were literate, who had any exposure to reading and writing, were people of Muslim descent, or people who studied the Quran. And so she has to have a Muslim father in order to be exposed to reading and writing before she's abducted. And so her father is one of the few in the village who has the Quran, who reads, and she longs to learn to read and write. And even though she has not acquired literacy by the time she's abducted, the desire to acquire it pushes her into this hunger when she's in the new world and has an opportunity to learn to read and write. So she has to have a Muslim father in order to be exposed to literacy in 1745 in Mali, thus a Muslim name, Aminata. Yes?
Two questions. How much did the historical timeline impact the selecting of her being 10 years old? So her story begins at the age of 10. I'm thinking, why not any other age? She could have been a young or older young woman. And second, why did you select our readers onto the novel to be this exchange between her and this 10-year-old white British child as our way of learning her story?
Why did I have her, why did the novel open with this exchange with this child who's about the age that she was when she's abducted? Well, I'm hoping that there's an emotional resonance for the reader, that she, as an old woman, is running across a child, a privileged white girl in London who's the very age that she was when she's abducted. So I'm hoping, without saying it out loud, that this will sit, in the reader's heart and affect the reader. Why did I choose to have her be sort of just on the cusp of adolescence and puberty when she's abducted? Because one, I want her to be old enough to know where she comes from and naive enough to want to go back and to think that it will be possible to go back. And so that's a really critical age. At 11, she's already got very serious responsibilities in her village. She's catching babies by the time she's 11. So she's in many ways, she's acting as an adult in some capacities, and but young enough to dream, and young enough to have the emotional resilience to survive what will destroy other people on the middle passage. I think I'm being told by Susan Levine that I should knock it off, but I will hang around for individual chatting if you'd like to.
Please join us for more informal conversation at a reception just in the back, and hope to see you all tomorrow.
Thank you very much.